Hello, my name is Remy, and today I'd like to talk about something that almost ended my marriage but also changed the way I see relationships forever. My wife, Ivy, and I have been married for many years. We've had ups and downs, as do most couples. But, over time, I noticed a pattern, which I wish I had recognized sooner. When Ivy didn't get her way, she would shut down emotionally. She would not argue. She would not explain. And she wouldn't say what was bothering her directly. Instead, she used a different method. She would avoid intimacy. At first, I didn't think much about it. I assumed it was simply a mood thing. Perhaps she needed some space. But as I paid closer attention, I realized it wasn't random. It was calculated. If I declined something she requested, whether it was a favor, a decision, or simply a disagreement, she was suddenly not in the mood. And it wasn't just about physical intimacy. She'd act distant, uninterested, and cold. At first, I gave in because, honestly, who wants to deal with such tension in their own home? I try to fix things, reassure her, and occasionally change my mind in order to get things back to normal. And, guess what? It worked every time. When she got what you wanted, she'd be affectionate as if nothing had happened. Looking back, I can see exactly what happened. Ivy had discovered that she could manage the situation without raising her voice, arguing, or even asking twice. All she had to do was make me think I was losing her. For a long time, I played right into it. I convinced myself that if I just gave her what she wanted, we'd be happy. But this time was different, because I had finally come to a realization. I was tired of feeling like I had to earn my wife's love, and I wasn't going to play that game any longer. I recall the final straw that broke everything. Ivy had been talking about the designer bag for weeks, some limited edition overpriced item that, in her opinion, was an absolute must. It wasn't just a desire. She made it seem like something she deserved. I did not argue with her about it. I understood that everyone enjoys nice things, and I never hesitated to spoil my wife whenever possible. However, the way she approached it, as if it were an expectation rather than a request, bothered me. One evening, she brought it up again. We were sitting in the living room when she showed me the bag on her phone for what seemed like the 100th time. "Babe, my birthday is coming up. This is the one that I want." Her tone was not enthusiastic or hopeful. It was firm, as if she was finalizing a deal. I glanced at the price. It wasn't impossible, but it wasn't money I could throw around carelessly. "Ivy, I know you really want it, so I'll get it for you. Just not now." I told her. I kept my tone neutral, careful not to sound dismissive. I considered it a reasonable response. I was not saying no. I was just saying, not yet. But, for Ivy, not yet was the same as never. Her expression shifted instantly. She let out a dramatic sigh and threw her phone on the couch. Then came the silent treatment. I could practically hear the gears turning in her head, calculating how she would punish me for not immediately giving her what she desired. She finally snapped. "Because you are saying not now." As if that meant anything. I shrugged, maintaining my composure. "Soon, Ivy. I just need to finish a few other tasks first." That was not enough for her. "Forget it," she muttered, getting up and walking to her bedroom. I sat there for a while, staring at the blank TV screen, wondering when we got to this point. When every conversation became a battle, and compromise gave way to control. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, it was the first indication of what was to come. That night, after my usual routine, I slid into bed next to her. Normally, I wrap an arm around her and pull her close. Nothing major, just a simple, natural thing couples do. But the moment my arm touched her, she pulled away. "Don't," she spoke flatly. I blinked, confused. "What?" "I am not in the mood for anything," she clarified, as if I had just done something inappropriate. I hadn't initiated anything more than a simple touch. This was a calculated response. This was punishment. "I just wanted to hold you." I spoke calmly but firmly. "Well, I don't want you to hold me," she responded without looking at me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling a shift within me. I'd seen this pattern before. Every time I refused to give in to her demands, she withdrew her affection. Every disagreement resulted in cold shoulders, silent treatment, and finally outright rejection. And every time, I'd been the one to apologize and make things right, so we could get back to normal. But this time, I wasn't going to pretend I didn't recognize what it was. I was not going to beg for affection like a misbehaving child. This was deliberate. And for the first time, I made a decision that would alter everything. I was not going to play this game anymore. Instead of wasting my energy trying to get her attention, I directed it toward myself. In the days that followed, I began to fill my time with activities I had previously enjoyed. But I had let go of the guitar that had been collecting dust in the corner. I picked it up again. I resumed reading the books I'd abandoned halfway through. I even started working out again, not to impress Ivy, but because it felt good to do something for myself. If you don't want to talk to me, that's fine. If you don't want to be around me, that's fine. I was not going to pursue her for the first time in a long time. I was not trying to make things right. I was simply letting things be. The shift occurred naturally. I was done focusing all of my attention on someone who only gave me the bare minimum when it suited her. So when her friends arrived, I didn't hold back. I was the same charming, funny, and engaging person I had always been. But I wasn't saving that energy for Ivy when her friends came over. Rather than sitting in the background, I made an effort to participate in the conversation. If one of them had a new hairstyle, I noticed and complimented them. If someone told a joke, I laughed and contributed to the fun. I established eye contact. I listened to what they said, nodding, reacting, and asking follow-up questions. And you know what? They replied. They laughed at my jokes. They started conversations with me and seemed to enjoy my company at social gatherings. I stopped hovering around Ivy. Instead, I became the focus of my own attention. I was not overdoing it. I was present. I made sure people felt heard and appreciated, so they gravitated toward me, which Ivy noticed. She was not used to seeing me this way, so at ease and effortlessly engaging. She wasn't used to me not seeking her out, looking for her approval, or waiting for her to accept me back. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing her. I was simply being myself. And suddenly, that version of myself was in high demand. Ivy had always been confident in her ability to handle the situation. This time, I focused my energy elsewhere, and she quickly noticed. At first, I could tell she wasn't particularly concerned. She probably assumed I was just sulking, waiting for her to decide whether I was worthy of her affection again. But when she noticed how easily she connected with her friends, something changed. I was not focused on her. Her friends took notice, too. They started lingering around me more, cracking jokes and drawing me into conversations. Some of them even contacted me directly, instead of going through Ivy as they used to. Above all, Ivy was taken aback by this. We met at a mutual friend's house one evening for a small gathering. Jessica, a friend I've known for years, laughed a little too hard at one of my jokes and lightly touched my arm. It wasn't serious, but it made Ivy nervous. And when another friend, Melanie, smiled and asked, "How come your husband is so much fun? I feel as if I don't know this side of him." She said nothing, but she was paying close attention now. Things only got worse from there. Vanessa, another friend, playfully nudged Ivy and said, "Girl, if you ever get tired of him, send him my way." She was obviously joking, but Ivy did not laugh. Over the next few days, Ivy became more aware. I noticed her watching me at social gatherings. Her eyes swept over my interactions, as if she were trying to pick apart every conversation, smile, and laugh. One night, I walked into the bedroom to get something and found her sitting on the edge of the bed, holding my phone. She didn't even hear me enter at first. When she realized I was there, she quickly put the phone down, as if she hadn't just finished going through it. The funniest part? There was nothing to be found. I had done nothing wrong. But the fact that she felt compelled to check told me everything I needed to know. She was losing her grip, and she knew it. Her frustration grew from there. The more she tried to find something suspicious, the more frustrated she became when she failed. I hadn't cheated. I was not sneaking around, and this realization was eating her alive. When I got home from work one evening, she had changed her clothes. Instead of her usual sweatpants and oversized t-shirt, she wore a fitted dress that hugged her curves perfectly. Her hair was neatly done, and makeup was lightly applied. She was not going anywhere. She'd just arrived home. However, it was clear that she wanted to be seen. Then began the conversations. She suddenly began making an effort to talk to me again, asking about my day, laughing at things she normally ignored, and occasionally throwing in compliments. "You've been looking great lately," she said once while preparing the dinner table. I simply nodded and thanked her, keeping my response casual. In the past, I would have interpreted that as an invitation to get closer, but not this time. I knew exactly what was going on. She was testing the waters to see if I'd bite the bait and fall back into the same cycle in which she controlled, when I received attention and when I didn't. Then there was something I had not seen in a long time. She began cooking my favorite meals. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but after the third time in a week, it was clear Ivy wasn't the type to suddenly transform into a doting wife for no reason. Previously, she only did things like this when she expected something in exchange. But I didn't bite. I still spoke to her, sat at the dinner table, and responded when she spoke. But I was no longer desperate for her affection. And for the first time, she appeared to understand what it was like to be on the other end of the push-pull dynamic she had created. She couldn't get my attention on her own terms anymore. It was something she needed to earn. She tried harder. She laughed at all of my jokes, including the ones that were not funny. But the thing was, I saw through everything. She was hoping to get a reaction from me that would acknowledge her efforts and make her feel like she was regaining control. But I stood firm for the first time. I could tell she was the one who was uncertain. I was sitting in the living room one day, scrolling through my phone, when she came in and stood in front of me. "I miss the way things used to be," she said. Her voice was soft, but I could sense the weight behind it. I set down my phone and looked up at her. I did not say anything. Just waited. She took a breath. Her fingers twitched as if she was struggling to get the words out. "I feel like we're separated." I kept my expression neutral. Still no word. I wanted to see where she was going with this. Finally, she sat beside me, her shoulders tensed. "Can we speak?" That was it. That was the moment. I waited for the moment when she admitted that something was wrong, that she had been playing a game for too long and had lost control of it. I wasn't going to rub it in her face. I simply needed to be honest. I sighed and leaned forward, placing my arms on my knees. "I love you, Ivy." I spoke calmly and steadily. "But I'm done with games." She looked at me with an unreadable expression, but I could tell she was listening. Really listening. "If you want affection, it must be genuine," I continued. "Not something you give away when you get what you want. That is not love. That is control. And I'm not doing it anymore." She opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her fingers twisting in her lap. "This marriage isn't about control," I said, softening my tone but remaining firm. "If you want to be happy with me, we need to stop treating each other as competitors. I am not your opponent, Ivy. I never was." Silence filled the room. For the first time in a long while, we were not playing roles. We weren't avoiding each other, waiting for the other person to make the next move. We were just two people sitting in the same place. Facing the truth, she nodded slowly and exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for days. "I hear you," she whispered, and for the first time in a long while, I believed her. I observed the changes in Ivy's behavior. She didn't just put on a cute dress or prepare my favorite dinner to make me happy. She was really trying. I first noticed it in the smallest things. She inquired about my day not as a formality, but because she wanted to know. When I said no to something, she stopped rolling her eyes and asked why, taking the time to consider my response. It was unique, and I appreciated it. However, I didn't rush to meet her in the middle this time. That was the old me. I'd learned my lesson. Love isn't supposed to feel like a transaction, and I wasn't about to play that game anymore. If she wanted this marriage to work, it had to be based on mutual respect rather than her determining when I was worthy of affection. So I let her do the work, not out of pettiness, but to see if she was serious. And she was. She did not use intimacy as a weapon anymore. She did not push me away when she did not get what she wanted. She finally realized that our relationship was not about control. It was about collaborating. For me, the most significant shift did not occur within her. It was in me. I'd learned to value myself and accept that I deserved a marriage in which I didn't have to beg for basic love and respect. I loved Ivy and had never wanted to leave. But I refused to be manipulated again. And as a result of my decision to draw that line and refuse to back down, our marriage improved. It wasn't perfect, and no relationship is. But it was real. No more games and no more punishments. Just two people who had finally learned the proper way to love each other. And let me tell you, standing up for myself was the best decision I've made. Now, I am not saying that this is a one-size-fits-all solution. Each relationship is unique. However, if you're in a situation where someone constantly holds affection over your head as a reward, ask yourself if this is truly love or control. Because, the truth is, if someone truly loves you, they will not treat intimacy as a commodity. You only get it if you act the way they want. So, what do you all think? Have you ever faced a situation like this? Do you think I handled it correctly, or would you have done things differently? Here's the next story. The night was calm, in stark contrast to the storm of unease that was swirling in Nico's stomach. He stood outside her balcony. His childhood promise to her echoed in his mind. It had been years since that day, and while most would dismiss such a vow as insignificant, Nico was not like most people. He recalled when he was 12, and she was 8, playing by the ocean before lying on the warm sand and basking in the sun. "Nico, do you think I'm pretty?" Alyssa had inquired suddenly. "You're fine," he said with a shrug. "Do you think I am prettier than Shelley? Hope with her?" "She's taller," he said absently. "That does not answer my question." "I thought it did." Alyssa rolled onto her side with an exasperated huff and stood up, brushing sand from her dress. She began walking away, her pace a little too fast. Nico scrambled after her. "What is wrong?" he asked. "Nothing," she said, but she quickened her pace. "Please don't be like that. I was just teasing. I am not like anything. Stop acting like a baby. Stop being mean to me," she snapped. "You're exactly like Howard and Zachary. Why don't you become their friend and leave me alone?" Her voice wavered, and she ran away before he could respond. Nico paused for only a second before pursuing her. He caught up quickly and gently held her by the shoulders, looking down at her tear-stained face. "What exactly did they say to you?" His voice was calm, but his eyes were filled with quiet anger. If they had hurt her, they would have regretted it. "They called me ugly and a brat," she sniffled, "saying they didn't understand why you let me hang around you." Her voice broke, and she wiped her face. Nico's hands tightened slightly. "What else?" She paused, blushing as she looked away. "They said there must be something special about me that makes you put up with me all the time." She wasn't sure what they meant, but she knew it wasn't kind. The tears flowed again. Nico's expression darkened. "I am going to make them regret it," he muttered beneath his breath. But to her, he spoke softly. "Ally, don't listen to them. You're fun and smart, and I enjoy having you around." I sniffle. "I don't believe you. You are also the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. You are just trying to make me feel better. You don't think I'm beautiful?" She spoke between sobs. "Yes, I do." Nico also meant it. Her big green eyes and button nose reminded me of a little wood sprite. Her wavy blonde hair was so smooth and soft that he found himself stroking it unconsciously. Sometimes. He had loved her since the first time he saw her. He was too young to understand his emotions or what to do about them. Instead of telling her that he loved her and would do anything for her, as he would, he teased her, poked her, and shoved her. But today, with her so upset and him staring down at her pretty little face, even with her puffy red eyes and snotty nose, he couldn't crack a joke. Instead, he did what came to mind. He kissed her. He gently pressed his lips against hers, and a spark of fire raced through him. He wished it would never end because it was so intense and wonderful. When he finally pulled away, she said, "Do you really think I'm pretty?" "Yes." "Is she attractive enough for marriage?" "Absolutely." "Will you marry me, then?" "Of course." Alyssa gave him a cute little smile and a kiss on the cheek before running home. Nico assumed she'd forget about her marriage proposal, but she didn't. She would then tell him about her plans for their future. Whether they were going to run a circus with him in charge of the lions, and her as the tightrope walker, or they were going to start a vineyard. He would plant the grapes, and she would smash them. And, despite her wild and impractical plans, Nico enjoyed hearing them and picturing the two of them married in the future. How soon? For both of them, it was a given that they would marry one day, and they would plan where they would live and what they would do. They were always together, regardless of their plans for the future. So he found himself standing outside her balcony on a calm and peaceful night, the eve of her wedding. Ready to kidnap, the bride declined her balcony and went up to her room. He saw her for the first time in what felt like forever. She took his breath away. She was as he remembered her. However, things are different. She was older, of course, and her beauty had only grown. He could see her body, because she had kicked off her covers in her sleep when she was still small. She appeared ripe and full in the right places. Her nightgown had ridden up, revealing one creamy white thigh, and Nico couldn't help but reach out and stroke it. He considered what he should do from here. He didn't want to startle her, but he needed to wake her and get her out of here. He wondered what she would do if she saw him. If she was angry or if she greeted him warmly. He would find out in one way or another. He addressed Alyssa gently. She opened her eyes groggily and let out a blood-curdling scream as soon as she saw him. Nico quickly placed his hand over her mouth to muffle her screams. She looked at him in terror and began to thrash and claw. Nico heard footsteps outside her door and wondered if anyone heard her scream. Nico wasn't sure what to do. There was no time to explain who he was, because she would just ask questions about where he had been and refuse to leave with him until she had the answers. And there simply wasn't time. "Do not scream, or I will strangle you," he whispered into her ear. She must have believed him, because she didn't say anything when he pulled his hand away. He picked her up and tossed her over his shoulder, like a sack of potatoes. He had just climbed out the window when he heard a soft knock at her door. He climbed down the balcony as quickly as possible, carrying a wiggling woman over his shoulder. He tossed her over the front of his horse and climbed up behind her. He knew she would be uncomfortable, but he needed to leave as soon as possible. He sent his horse off and ran, and when he was certain that no one was following them and that they were a safe distance away, he halted and drew her up to a sitting position. "Who are you? What do you want?" she demanded immediately, twisting around to look at him. She did not recognize him. Nico had a thought, but he didn't believe it right away. She was staring directly into his face, but she showed no signs of recognition. My fiancé will pay any ransom if you harm me. He'll track you down and assassinate you. Little did she know. She had said the very thing that would enrage him the most. Nico didn't want to hear about her fiancé, whom she clearly cared for, if not loved. And he didn't want to hear about the other man's devotion to her. He wanted to pretend the other man did not exist. Nico growled, I don't want any ransom. He wouldn't let her go. Not for any sum of money. So what do you want? Melissa cried out helplessly. If he didn't want money, would he attack or assassinate her? So, who was he? Shut up. Nico kicked his horse and set off at a steady gallop. Alyssa was scared to death. Who was this man? So, what did he want? Looking into his eyes, she had the strangest feeling of knowing him from somewhere, but she quickly dismissed it. This was a scoundrel. She couldn't recognize him from anywhere. Alyssa sat in the small, locked cabin where he had put her. He had led her to a beach, let his horse loose, and rowed her out to a ship. When she first saw what he had planned, all hope of escape vanished like a rain cloud, abruptly opening and pouring out its contents, drenching her in despair. Now she couldn't shake the terrible feeling that she was being taken away from her home, and might never return. She wouldn't have much to miss anyway, as her parents had died, leaving her with nothing and no one. She had stopped caring what happened to her, and had simply followed what others told her to do. She had gotten engaged because she did not have much money, and had few options. She didn't love her fiancé, and she didn't believe he loved her either. The real reason she didn't want to leave her house was because it contained all of her memories of Nico. But he had died. Alyssa lay down on the bed and closed her eyes. She couldn't stop the memory of the horrible day from returning. She was 12 years old and an aspiring artist. She had a passion for painting, and Nico had acquired the majority of her works. She had just finished her most recent one, and went over to his house to give it to him. But he wasn't there. His brother told her that he had died just that morning. He had fallen from the boat. They drowned while sailing. Alyssa was just beginning to feel the pain she had been experiencing when her kidnapper entered. What will you do to me? Alyssa asked. She was terrified of him, but she was more afraid of not knowing what would happen to her. I'm going to keep you, her kidnapper said, looking at her as if this was normal and not understanding why she was upset. Alyssa stared at him for a moment. What exactly was he talking about? Keep me for what? She inquired, completely perplexed. You are going to become my wife. Alyssa couldn't believe she had heard him right to his wife. Wait, what? What exactly are you talking about? Alyssa looked at him, puzzled. Nico walked over to the bed and sat down beside her. You are going to be my wife, he repeated gently, as if she were speaking to a child who had no idea what was going on. No, I am not. Alyssa was still confused. She was completely unfamiliar with this man. She was not going to marry him. Yes, you are. He told her more forcefully. You do not understand. I cannot. I am getting married tomorrow. No, you are not. He roared at her. You can simply forget about your old life and fiancé. You're never going to go back to him, so accept that you'll be staying with me. Nico couldn't believe he'd let his temper flare up like that, but she was making him angry. Why didn't she recognize him? Maybe she didn't remember him at all. But who are you? He heard her whisper softly. He couldn't tell whether she'd forgotten about him. He couldn't tell her. During his 6-year absence, he had little else on his mind besides her. You can call me whatever you want, he replied. Fine, you wanderer. Alyssa sat next to Nico in stony silence, eating her dinner. He made certain she received the best that the cook had to offer, but she clearly did not appreciate it as she shoveled food down her throat. I'm finished, she announced after a few minutes. Can I get a thank you? Nico asked for a reason, hoping she would recognize his efforts. Why should I thank you if you are the one who kidnapped me? Alyssa had been like this for the 3 days she had spent on his ship. Nico felt that he had been excessively considerate of her. He had even given up his bed and slept on the floor after she threw a fit when he attempted to climb in next to her. I've put up with your attitude for long enough, Alyssa. You've done nothing but complain and sulk since you arrived. And frankly, I'm sick of it. Nico demanded that she get over her anger so that they could move on with their lives. Oh, I am sorry I haven't been in such a good mood. I hope you'll forgive me. Seeing as I was just dragged out of my bed in the middle of the night and onto a ship, only to be told that I was to marry a complete stranger. Alyssa's voice was dripping with sarcasm. Nico wished he could tell her that she was only being forced to keep a promise she had made, but he preferred to maintain his anonymity. Whether you like it here or not, you will at least be civil, Nico said in a firm tone. Now, I want you to thank me for your supper. However, Alyssa ignored the warning in his voice. I will not, you miscreant, Alyssa said, crossing her arms and settling back in her chair, ready to sit there all night before saying thank you. You will say thank you. Or I will take you over my knee and blister your backside so severely that you will be unable to sit for a week. Nico was also prepared for a fight, but he was not willing to let it last all night. If you dare to touch me, my fiancé will track you down and execute you. Alyssa once again used her fiancé to hopefully deter him from carrying out his threat. Little did she know, she had said the exact thing that would cause Nico to put her over his knee. That was it, Nico said, physically picking her up and sitting down in the chair. Alyssa fought as hard as she could but was no match for her strength. Within a few minutes, he had her lying face down on his lap, an arm around her back, anchoring her to the spot. She hit his leg with her fists and yelled at him to stop but refused to apologize or beg. She was completely humiliated by the indignity of her position. When he lifted her dress and pulled her pants down, he exposed her bare bottom. When the first smack hit her, she cried out in surprise rather than pain. It was quickly followed by a second, a third, and a fourth. Will you say thank you? He inquired, but Alyssa refused to answer. I suppose you haven't learned your lesson, he said as he continued to spank her. What hadn't hurt so much the first time was now excruciatingly painful. As he continued to smack her already stinging bottom, Alyssa felt tears well up on her cheeks and let out small cries with each smack. Nico's rage had subsided, and he wished to end the punishment, but he was too stubborn to be the one to give in. He tried not to look at her rosy backside, for fear of losing his ability to beat the sore flesh, and he hardened his heart in response to her pitiful whimpering. Say thank you, Nico repeated, slowing his hand and allowing longer pauses between smacks. No, Nico, wanting to put an end to this, let his hand fall much harder than the previous times, and his heart nearly broke at the painful cry she let out. Say it. He practically begged. By this point, she was in tears. Thank you. The words were forced out of her between sobs. Nico was not happy to have won now that she had finally admitted it. He didn't feel like he'd won at all. He let his grip on her relax and pulled her underwear up and her dress down. Alyssa scrambled off his lap as soon as he let her go, huddled in the corner of the room, face down on her knees, crying. And when she was finally done crying, she remained there, refusing to look up or move. Nico had no idea what to do now. He didn't want to leave her, but she probably prefers to be alone. He moved over to her huddled form and picked her up. She remained wrapped in a tight little ball as he carried her over to the bed, gently laying her down before quietly leaving the room. After the day, Nico spanked her. Alyssa began acting exactly as he instructed her. She concealed her displeasure and acted politely, even though Nico would have preferred her as she was rather than the cold and distant way she acted now. She expressed a polite thank you for almost everything he gave her, answered his questions in a cool, impersonal manner while asking none of her own. And, instead of calling him various insulting names, she is now limited to calling him captain like the rest of the crew. Nico, hoping to win her favor, gave her a pair of breeches and a shirt so she could go up on deck. He knew her and knew she'd be eager to get out of the cabin and into the open air. She had eagerly gone on deck that day and ever since. Most of the men were initially upset by her presence on board, believing it was unlucky to have a female on a ship. But, soon, all the men were thoroughly charmed by her and had no problem taking time away from their work to show her around or talk to her. Alyssa enjoyed their rough company, and Nico was envious that she would open up to his men but not to him, but he said nothing about it. At least she appeared to be happy, even when he wasn't present. Nico returned to the deck after a brief stay in his cabin, to find his men in a frenzy. Come on, lass, you can do it. He overheard one of his men shout. This couldn't be good, he reasoned, and went over to see what was happening. To his horror, he saw Alyssa climbing the rigging and almost reaching the top. What is happening here? He bellowed. All I could think about was her. All of the men turned to look at him, but none said anything. They knew what was going on, and that he was upset about it. Alyssa, get down from there, he yelled to her. When Alyssa heard him, she turned and looked down. She knew it was a bad idea as soon as she realized how high she was. She gripped the rigging tighter and tried to move her foot downward, but it wouldn't cooperate. She was unable to move for fear of falling to her death. Alyssa, get down here now. She heard the captain yell again and tried desperately to obey, but she was too scared. She dreaded the punishment she'd face for this, but she just held on tighter. Nico noticed she wasn't moving and started up the rigging after her. When he reached her, he asked, "What are you doing up here, madam?" "I apologize. I assumed you wouldn't mind if I climbed it, and I tried to obey you by coming down, but I couldn't." Alyssa's voice shook slightly as she explained. "Why wouldn't you come down?" Nico asked gently. "I was too scared. Please don't punish me for this. I really tried to obey you, and I will never do so again." She replied humbly, looking at him pleadingly. "Oh, sweetheart. No. Nico was horrified to realize she had been so obedient, because she feared what he would do to her. She feared him. "I will not punish you." "No, nothing like that will ever occur again." Alyssa nodded, but he could tell she didn't fully believe him. "Alyssa, listen to me. I apologize for what I did. I allowed my anger to take control, which was wrong of me. I promise I'll never let it happen again. Will you forgive me?" His voice was full of emotion and sincerity, which surprised Alyssa. She could tell he was really sorry. "I forgive you," she said. "Really? I mean it." "Okay. Are you ready to get down from here?" he asked. She nodded as he continued. "All right. Simply don't look down and take your time. I refuse to let anything happen to you." Alyssa believed him, and felt less scared now that he was beside her. They began to climb down side by side, with him going slowly to match her pace, and everything was going well until she slipped. It happened so fast that she had no idea what had happened. But she knew she wasn't hanging on any longer. For a brief moment, she imagined herself falling to her death. But then a strong hand grabbed her wrist. "Hang on, ally. I've got you," Nico said, clutching her wrist in a death grip. He lifted her with one arm, as if she weighed nothing more than a doll, and held her until she found her feet. "Do not scare me like that." He gently scolded her when she was safe again. Alyssa felt her heart racing, and gripped the ropes as tightly as she could. After a long time, her heart rate slowed, but she couldn't relax. "Are you prepared to try again?" Nico asked, but Alyssa firmly shook her head. "No, that is perfectly fine by me." He teased her, saying, "We can just stay up here for the rest of our lives." Alyssa smiled, but she did not want to go again. Nico scooted closer to her and wrapped his arm around her back, gripping the ropes on the opposite side of her body. "I've got you, and I promise not to let you fall," he whispered into her ear. For some reason, Alyssa was comforted by the thought that he would fall before allowing her to. "Okay, we can go," she said, hesitantly, and they began to slowly descend the ropes again. When they reached the deck, all of Nico's men cheered and congratulated Alyssa on her bravery. She thanked them but was relieved when the captain ushered her back to his cabin. It wasn't until they got there that she realized he'd referred to her as an ally. And there was only one person who had ever done so. Nico. No, it cannot be. Nico had died, right? Alyssa stared at his face, which was rugged and manly. She could see a resemblance to the boy she used to know now that she was looking for it. "Nico," she replied hesitantly. Nico, who was now turning down the covers on the bed with his back to her, snapped to attention immediately. He spun around to face her, and she knew immediately that this was her Nico. She wasn't sure how it happened, but it was him. "Oh, Nico," she exclaimed, flying into his arms. She had forgotten about the time she had recently spent with him, and she was simply greeting her childhood love. She hugged him, melting her body into his, and he held her tightly in return. Nico was taken aback by her greeting, but he quickly became engrossed in memories of the last time he saw her and felt guilty for expecting her to greet him in any other way. This was his ally. She would always remain his. After a long time of simply holding each other, Alyssa pulled back and unceremoniously punched him in the arm. "Why haven't you told me?" "It seems stupid now," he said, unwilling to admit that he didn't tell her who he was because he was afraid. She didn't love him anymore. "Oh, Nico, where have you been? I thought you had died." She spoke again, wrapping herself around him. "Dead? Where did you get the idea?" Nico asked. "Your brother told me. But it wasn't only me. Everyone thought you had died, including your family, your father." "Oh, Nico," she said, her voice becoming sadder for him. "Your father? I understand." He cut her off, preventing her from having to deliver bad news. "He died last year. I overheard. I've also heard about your parents. I'm very sorry, sweetheart. It was difficult, especially because you weren't there." She spoke while burying her face in his neck. Nico regretted not being there for her when she needed him. But he also felt his heart skip a beat when she said she needed him. "And then I discovered that they had left me with nothing. The money was all gone. Even our house had been sold to your brother. He was very kind, however, allowing me to live there and then proposing to marry me when I had nowhere else to go." Nico had listened to her with growing sympathy and compassion, but when he heard the final part, he stiffened and pulled away from her. "You were planning to marry my brother?" he inquired, not fully understanding what she was telling him. "What else can I do?" she explained, trying to make him understand that this was her only option. "So that's who was supposed to save you. You were desperate to reconnect with this person. Do you love him? Do you make love with him?" He said something so cruel that Alyssa recoiled. Nico was badly hurt here. He thought he had her love, but now it appeared that she was simply greeting an old friend in his jealousy. He could only see her hug as one for the fiancé's brother. She'd not kissed him. How do you say that? I only said those things to stop you from executing me. As you know, I thought you were a ruthless murderer. I was terrified of you while you laughed at your little trick. Now that Alyssa had recovered from the shock of seeing him again, after 6 years, she had time to be angry with him. Why didn't you say who you were? She asked angrily. Nico looked at her sheepishly, ashamed of himself. Of course, she was afraid of him. He'd kidnapped her. You did not recognize me. I waited until you did. What is his response? Alice was enraged by his words. I did not recognize you. She screamed at him. Is this really so unexpected? Do you know what I went through when I thought you were dead? I mourned you so much. I had to train myself to stop thinking about you. Do not look for your features in a crowd. Do not expect to see your face. You were dead, and I had to stop dreaming that you weren't. It was the only way I could move forward with my life. Nico felt overwhelmed with guilt over what she had said. Not only had he not told her who he was, but she had mourned him. And just as you were getting on with your life and getting engaged, I had to come along and ruin it for you. I apologize, he said, avoiding her gaze. Nico, you have once again completely misunderstood me. Haven't you heard a word I've said? She spoke in a much softer voice. I attempted to move on with my life, but I didn't really. I simply pushed you to the back of my mind, forcing myself not to think about you because it was too painful. You were always present, though. I never got over you. Nico, I love you. I always have and will. Nico immediately drew her into his arms, feeling as if heaven had opened up for him. She loved him. Overcome with emotion, he cradled her face and kissed her on the forehead. They had exchanged innocent embraces as children, but this time was different. It was heavy with the weight of time, longing, and a love that had grown over the years. I love you, he whispered. His voice was raw with emotion. Oh, Allie. The only reason I didn't tell you who I was that I assumed you loved your fiancé. I was afraid that if you knew how much I still loved you, you would feel differently. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with warmth. Do not worry. I couldn't stop loving you. I couldn't love anyone else. Only you. Only you. They clutched each other tightly, cherishing the intimacy they had both craved. The years apart had altered them. But in this embrace, they felt as if time had reversed, returning them to the purest form of love they had always shared. Later, as they sat beneath the moonlit sky, Ali rested her head on Nico's shoulder. Nico, she inquired, tracing small patterns across his hand. What happened so many years ago? Why did everyone believe you had drowned? Why did you leave? Nico gave a deep sigh, bringing her closer. I was on the boat with my brother when the weather turned bad. We tried to get home, but the waves were too strong. The next thing I knew, I was in the water, struggling to stay afloat. He looked into the distance, as if reliving the moment. I swam as hard as I could, hoping that my brother would find me, but I was losing strength. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, a rope was thrown to me. I barely had enough energy to grab it before passing out. When I awoke, I was aboard a ship, rescued but far from home. Ollie tightened her grip on his hand, her heart breaking for him. All this time, we thought we had lost you. I never stopped thinking about you, he confessed. Every day. She smiled and rested her head on his chest. You are now at home. That is all that matters. When I awoke, I was surprised to find myself on a pirate ship, rather than my brother's. They'd pulled me out of the water. I tried to tell them that I was the Duke's son. Try to persuade them to take me back. Of course, they did not believe me. They made me the new cabin boy. And I learned how to sail and sword fight. As I grew older, I rose through the ranks, eventually becoming captain. I'm ashamed to admit that I didn't want to come back. I enjoyed my new life too much, free of the pomp and responsibilities of being a Duke's son. But I've always planned to come back for you. Ali and I would have arrived sooner if we had known you needed us. So you'll never go back? She asked. You aren't going to claim your title and money? I hadn't planned on it, he explained. So what about me? Do you realize that I cannot spend the rest of my life on a pirate ship? What about when we do? She came to an abrupt halt. What happens when we have what? Nico asked. Never mind, she said, shaking her head. I got ahead of myself. What? What is it? Never mind, she said, and Nico doubted she would go on. But then she abruptly spoke. I was speaking under the impression that we were going to marry. But I just realized you haven't even asked me. Of course, having a wife would interfere with your piracy, she explained, turning away from him. Nico extended his arm and turned her back to face him. I did not think I needed to ask you. You asked me. Or did you forget that we were already engaged? He said with a teasing tone in his voice. Oh, Nico, you have to go back. Don't you see how unsuitable a ship is for a baby? She asked. Yes, he replied, wrapping his arms around her and placing his chin on her head. Whatever you want, sweetheart. We'll go back. But first, I think you mentioned a baby. I believe we should get started on making that happen right now. You know how much I want to please you, he said. As he bent down and kissed her, Alyssa stood on the boat's prow, allowing the wind to stroke her hair. She was heading home with Nico. She couldn't believe it was actually happening. Then, all of a sudden, strong arms encircled her waist from behind, and she realized this was real. Look, Nico, I see land, she said, pointing it out to him. Nico chuckled. There was no way you could overlook it. Oh yes, there it is. She spun around in the circle of his arms, wrapping hers around his neck. She pressed her face against his shoulder, inhaling his manly scent. Can you believe it? We're finally together again, she said, pulling back and looking into his eyes. I knew we would be. We're meant to be together. Nothing can keep us apart. I did not know. I thought I had lost you forever. Nico couldn't bear the pain that suddenly appeared in her eyes. She always had that expression on her face when she talked about the time she thought he was dead. He groaned and leaned in to kiss her. It appeared to be the only thing that relieved her pain. The only thing that could persuade her was that it was all true. The only thing that convinced her they wouldn't be separated again. Alyssa stood on tiptoe to gain better access to his mouth. She intensified the kiss, ravishing his mouth with her own, until she heard catcalls behind them. She pulled away without looking. The men stared at the scene they were creating. Damn, it is hot. One of them said, You have a very affectionate girl there, Captain. You better be careful to keep her, or I'll try my hand at it. No chance, Hubert. Alyssa replied amicably. Despite the fact that the men were crass and constantly fought, they stole whatever they wanted. They all had good hearts. Alyssa recognized it in them, and had formed a bond with a disparate group. She turned around to face the ocean and a faint line of land in the background. Nico kept his arms around her, and she placed her hands on top of his, which rested on her stomach. He rested his chin on the top of her head. Alyssa remembered another time when they were in the same position, when she was 12 and he was 16. She had assumed that he had died only a few weeks earlier. She had been over at his house, and they were out in the garden eating blackberries from the bush, when Nico suddenly bent down to kiss her lips. He often pressed chaste kisses against her lips, but this time she pulled back before he could. Nico looked perplexed and tried again, but she pulled back. Alyssa laughed at his annoyed expression, as she enjoyed teasing him in this way. She suddenly stood on tiptoe, and pressed a soft kiss on his cheek, before fleeing to Iran. Come back here, you little minx, he called after her and dashed off to catch up. Alyssa had giggled with childish delight at their game. She dashed into the house, running down the hall, in and out of rooms. Nico is chasing her. She had finally paused in his room to catch her breath, and when she looked up, she noticed it on the wall. It was one of her paintings, a self-portrait, and it was hanging on his wall, framed. She simply stood there, staring at it, her face staring back at her. He hung it up, which made her feel special, as if she were an actual artist. She hadn't heard him enter the room, but she felt his arms around her and his chin resting on her head. Oh, Nico, she said you'd hung up. Of course, I did. It's beautiful. She had turned around in his arms and allowed him to kiss her again. She felt like she was the most valuable thing in the world to him when he held her like that. That day, he did something he'd never done before. He hesitantly removed his tongue from his mouth and brushed her lips. Alyssa jumped back, surprised by the unexpected sensation. He had just smiled at her surprised expression, and she had giggled nervously before taking his hand and leading him back outside to eat more blackberries. What are you thinking about? Nico asked the question. She remembered Jared Alyssa and turned to face him again. I was just thinking about the day we ate so many blackberries. Do you remember? How could I forget? He said, allowing his lips to gently touch hers. He quickly wiped his tongue across her closed mouth. Alyssa drew back and laughed up at him. You were so young, and I had to be patient and gentle with you, despite my desire to go further. She smiled and rested her head on his chest, his heart pounding in her ears. You can go as far as you like now, okay? You two will have to row in from here. Smithy said this later, when they were much closer to the shore. Nico ordered the men to drop anchor, which Smithy repeated louder. Nico said, In you go, picking up Alyssa by the waist and placing her in one of the rowboats before climbing in himself. Bye, Nico. Smithy said gruffly, attempting to conceal the emotion in his eyes. Bye, Captain. Nico proudly responded, having delegated the position to his former first mate. Goodbye, everyone. Alyssa called out to the crew, despite the fact that they had all said their goodbyes earlier. As the small rowboat was lowered into the ocean, the ship became filled with parting words and waves of goodbye. When they hit the clear blue water, Nico took up the oars and began rowing slowly and steadily toward shore. Are you nervous? Melissa asked. No. She knew he was. Don't worry, everything will be fine. He just glowered at her and continued rowing. Alyssa smiled to herself and hid it while looking down at her lap. She turned to face the boat, which had its sails up and was about to leave again. She let her fingers trail across the surface of the water, watching Nico's arms work as he rowed. She was calm, with the sparkling ocean surrounding her and Nico by her side. But she became increasingly excited as they approached land. When they were only a few yards away, she couldn't contain her excitement and jumped out of the boat and into the cool water without saying a word. Ally? She heard Nico call from behind her. She quickly swam away from the boat. She was only wearing a thin day dress and no corsets or petticoats, so she swam freely through the water. Nico watched Alyssa swim away and quickly dove into the water after her. The boat was momentarily forgotten. His strong, steady strokes quickly brought him to her side. Grinning, he reached out and tugged on her legs, briefly pulling her underwater before they both surfaced. Alyssa laughed and gently pushed Nico's head under the water. When he resurfaced, he splashed her, and she retaliated, resulting in an all-out water fight. The air was filled with laughter and splashes of foamy water. After a while, Alyssa realized Nico had stopped. She called out, scanning the water for him before she could respond. He appeared behind her, giving her a playful notch. She shrieked in surprise, then burst out laughing, gently pushing him away before swimming back to shore. As they approached the shallows, Nico caught up and swept her into his arms with ease. He spun her slightly, causing Alyssa to laugh again. Put me down, troublemaker, she teased. But he just grinned and carried her to the shore. Alyssa wiggled her toes as they approached the sand, unconcerned about her playful protests. Nico eventually set her down after realizing she had lost her slippers in the water, and they stood side by side, catching their breath and grinning at their lighthearted adventure. Do you remember when you last carried me like this? She asked. You were 6 when you fell and twisted your ankle on those rocks over there. He pointed his head to the left of them. Yeah. And you had to carry me the entire way home. She nodded. You were crying so hard, Alyssa said with a small laugh. You told me that the only way to make you feel better was for me to sing to you. Nico chuckled, and so did I. Even though I disliked singing, you sang to me all the way home. She rested her head on his shoulder. Nico held her closer as they approached his house. He carried her up the stairs and paused at the front door. She knocked lightly, and as soon as it opened, he led her inside. The butler was taken aback when he saw the 2 rain-soaked, disheveled figures. Mistress Alyssa, a maid, gasped in disbelief. Nico recognized her immediately. It was Miss S. Hensley, his former nanny. She had practically raised him, as well as Alyssa, because they spent so much time together as children. Alyssa took a quick step forward, her bare feet tapping against the marble floor, and hugged the old woman tightly. Miss S. Hensley hugged her and affectionately patted her cheek. Oh, Miss Alyssa, I was afraid you were gone for good. She spoke with tears in her eyes. What has happened to you? And who is the man who carried you in? Miss S. Hensley turned to Nico, and Alyssa smiled. Don't you recognize him? It's Nico. The elderly woman stared at him, her eyes widening in surprise. She took a step closer, carefully studying his features. By the saints. It's Nico, she said, placing her hands on his shoulders and pulling him into a tight embrace. Nico hesitated for a brief moment before returning the hug. He had forgotten the warmth and comfort her motherly presence provided. She pulled away, still looking at him, but before any further words could be exchanged, the study door flew open. Nico's brother, Alaric Bancroft, entered the hall, accompanied by several well-dressed gentlemen. What the hell is going on here? Alaric demanded, his gaze sweeping across the 2 disheveled figures in his foyer. But the moment his gaze fell on Alyssa, his expression changed from irritation to shock. Alyssa, he breathed. I thought you were gone. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and drew her into an embrace. Thank God you are all right. The hug lasted only a moment before Nico firmly pulled her away. Alaric narrowed his gaze at him. And exactly who do you think you are? He asked coldly. Nico met his gaze. Don't you recognize me? Alaric frowned. Why would I recognize an urchin like you? Please take your hands off my fiancée. She's no longer your fiancée. Nico spoke, his voice as cold as ice. Alaric got a deadly look in his eye and took a menacing step forward. You can now listen here. I stop it. Alyssa interrupted him. Are you brothers? Alaric cast an incredulous look at Nico as she spoke. No, this is not possible. Nicholas has died. Nico stepped forward and said, No, it's really my brother. Alaric stepped back. This is insane, he exclaimed, shaking his head. Alyssa. He looked to her for confirmation. Yes, Alaric. It is indeed Nico. He had never died, after all. Everything she says is true. A white-haired man who had emerged from the study with Alaric stepped forward. Nico recognized him as one of his father's closest friends, Magnus of Rathburn. I remember that boy. And this is him. Oh, if only your father were still alive to see your return. Nico's heart sank as he remembered his father. You cannot be, Nicholas. Alaric continued to argue. I watched him drown 6 years ago. Please, brother. Recognize me? Nico begged. What is the matter with you, boy? The Magnus of Rathburn addressed Alaric. Your brother has miraculously returned to us. Rejoice at his return. Of course, Alaric replied stiffly, stepping forward. It's nice to have you back. There was a long pause before he added, brother rather. Then he wrapped his arms around Nico, and the brothers embraced. However, it was not a warm and loving hug. It was cold and brittle, and it was over in an instant. Come, son, tell us where you've been. The Magnus insisted, bringing Nico into the study. Alyssa attempted to follow him, but Miss S. Hensley stopped her. Alyssa, come with me before you die. She held her arm. We need to get you into some dry, appropriate clothing. Alyssa followed Miss S. Hensley, but her gaze remained on Nico as she walked away. He watched her helplessly in return before being drawn into the study. Alyssa rolled around restlessly in bed. She and Nico had been back for a week, and the majority of that time had been spent visiting old friends and acquaintances, dealing with the bank, and completing all of the paperwork associated with Nico's unexpected return from the dead. She had been staying in Nico's guest room because Alaric had sold her house while she was away and fired all of her servants. She could have been angry, but she thought it didn't matter. Nico, and she would get married soon anyway. The only problem was that she had grown accustomed to his presence beside her while sleeping on the ship, and she now missed him greatly. Even worse, he was only a few doors down but separated by polite society's rules. She didn't want to cause a scandal for him, especially since he'd only recently returned and was probably exhausted from his long and demanding days. Still, she lay awake and restless. She missed him the few times they had been alone together. His brother had interrupted. Alyssa would not have minded Alaric's presence if he had been attempting to reconnect with Nico after so many years apart. Instead, Alaric simply sat, scowled, and sneered. She knew he'd never been close to his brother, but she hoped that with time, his heart would soften. Unfortunately, it became clear that wasn't going to happen, which hurt because she knew how much Nico desired his brother's acceptance. She sat up in her bed, frustrated. Nico needed her as much as she did him. She hesitated briefly before slipping out of her room and tiptoeing to his. The door was unlocked, and she quietly closed it behind her. I was wondering when you would arrive. Nico murmured in the darkness, and Alyssa began. I thought you were sleeping. He responded sleepily. I missed you. She smiled. I missed you, too. She lay beside him, comforted by his presence, just as she was about to fall asleep. A strange sound caused her to freeze. Nico, she whispered. Have you heard that? Hear what? It sounds like breathing. Before she could comprehend what was happening, a dark figure appeared from the shadows. Alyssa's sharp gasp filled the room, and Nico jumped up instinctively, placing himself in front of her. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing Alaric's smiling face. What are you doing here? Nico demanded, his voice tinged with fury. Then he noticed the glint of metal in Alaric's hand. What are your thoughts? Alaric smiled, twisted into something cruel. I am here to execute you. Alyssa's breath hitched in horror, but Nico remained motionless, his gaze fixed on his brother. I should not have to do this, Alaric continued, his voice full of venom. If you had died 6 years ago, as planned, none of this would be necessary. I would be the Duke. I'd have all of the wealth and be the only person in Alyssa's life. Nico's jaw clenched. You pushed me into the water that day, right? Alaric chuckled without humor. Of course, it was a perfect plan. You were always the favorite and firstborn. But without you, I would have had everything. A sharp knock on the door relieved the tension, but neither of them moved. Alaric's gaze shifted to Alyssa, who was tightly gripping the covers beneath her chin. It was only later that I realized you were a bonus. Alaric muttered, his expression darkening. You turned out to be quite the beauty. I admit I was surprised to see her sneak in, just as I was about to finish you off. And once I figured out what you were up to, I couldn't stop watching it all unfold. Of course, I will have to deal with her now. That's a shame, but it's necessary. Nico charged at Alaric with an angry snarl. In his rage, he forgot about the knife Alaric was holding, and it struck him in the side, inflicting a deep wound. Alyssa screamed again, as she saw the red liquid dripping from Alaric's knife. The knocking outside the door became more urgent, and she heard some muffled voices calling out. Nico quickly twisted around, ignoring his wound, and grabbed the wrist with the knife. Using brute strength, Nico twisted Alaric's wrist until the knife fell from his grasp and landed on the floor. Nico drew back his hand and landed a powerful punch directly on Alaric's jaw. Alaric staggered back from the pain, and Nico struck him again. Alaric jabbed out quickly, hitting Nico right in the wound. The blow was not powerful, but it was strategic, and Nico yelled at the pain coursing through his body. Alaric used that time to reach for the knife. He was holding it menacingly when Nico charged him again. Alaric lashed out with the knife, but Nico moved too quickly, and Alaric missed him. Nico grabbed the knife again, and Alaric used his other hand to hold it. Nico grabbed it with both hands, and they struggled to control the knife between them. Nico used his body strength to slam Alaric into the wall. Alaric turned and did the same to Nico. They banged and struggled around the room until they both fell to the ground. When Nico stood up, the knife was protruding from Alaric's chest and lodged right in his heart. Nico stumbled away from the body, and Alyssa jumped up to lead him to the bed. She was unaware of the tears streaming down her cheeks as she pressed a pillow against Nico's bleeding wound. "Oh, Nico." She made certain. "It's fine," he assured. "But you are hurt. There's barely a scratch." "I've had far worse." Nico and Elisa became aware of the banging on the door at the same time, and had just covered their nakedness with blankets when a swarm of servants stormed into the room. "Miss S." Hensley exclaimed, her gaze drawn away from Alaric's lifeless body on the floor. "Horns?" Nico demanded. "Go fetch the chief of police. Alaric tried to dispose of us." The servants gasped. But the ever-efficient hands appeared unfazed and nodded obediently. "And see a doctor." "Nico is hurt," Alyssa said. Horns nodded again and quickly exited the room. "You're hurt, dear. Where is it, Miss S?" Hensley spoke up, worried. Nico just cleared his throat embarrassingly. "Nothing serious. It can wait until the doctor arrives, Miss S." Hensley blushed to the roots of her hair as she realized why they were huddled together under the blanket. "Of course, children." She turned to the servants. "Grab Alaric's body and take it downstairs. Everyone else is out." Two men stepped forward to carry the body, and Mrs. Hensley directed everyone else out of the room. "Are you okay?" Alyssa inquired as to when everyone had left. "Yes. I told you it was just a scratch." "No, I'm talking about your brother. He attempted to murder you, and now he is dead." Nico simply looked at her and shook his head sadly. "He was my brother. But I am not sorry I destroyed him. I'd do anything to protect you. Do you know that?" "Yes," she said, hugging his neck. "You've saved my life. You saved mine as well. It's a good thing you came to me when you did. Otherwise, I'd be dead in my sleep right now." Alyssa shuddered. "Don't say things like that," she warned, hugging him tighter. He kissed the top of her head. "You'd better put your nightgown back on before the doctor arrives or one of the servants returns." Alyssa slipped out of bed and picked up her nightgown from the floor, slipping it over her head. He sank back into bed, keeping the pillow pressed against his wound. Alyssa approached and sat next to him, covering him with a blanket and modestly stroking his hair from his forehead. "The doctor is here." Mrs. Hensley arrived a little later. "Allie put my robe on," Nico told her, gesturing to his robe, which was lying on the chair. She smiled and slipped into his oversized robe, which swallowed her up while covering her more effectively than her flimsy nightgown. She stayed with him while the doctor examined his wound, cleaned it, and sewed it closed. "Don't strain yourself for a while," the doctor advised. "You don't want to open your stitches, so take 2 of these per day with plenty of water and rest." He handed him a bottle of small pills. "I'll be back in 3 days to make sure everything is healing properly." And with that, he stood up and walked out of the room. "Should I contact the police to obtain your statement, Miss S?" Hensley inquired as to when the doctor had left. "No. He can speak to them tomorrow. Right now he needs to rest." "Nonsense," Nico said. "I'm fully capable." "No," Alyssa calmly cut him off. "You overheard the doctor. You should rest." Nico wanted to argue further, but he was tired. Mrs. Hensley told Alyssa, "I'll take you back to your room before I tell them to leave." "No, it will not be necessary." Alyssa refused. "Miss S." Hensley looked at her for a moment before letting out a defeated sigh. "All right. But I warned you to be discreet with the other servants," she said as she exited the room. "It's probably too late for that," Alyssa said after she left. "It's too late for that," Nico said, pulling her down and against his good side. "I know it's an odd emotion to have after what just happened, but I'm happy. I'm extremely happy. I'm also happy, sweetheart. How can I not hold you in my arms and look ahead to our future?"